Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the Warner Archive Blu-ray of Action of the Tiger, which is a 1957 MGM co-production with a British interests in the same sort of manner that you see a lot of British-made films throughout the 1950s and into the 60s be, where they would either co-produce with an American company or an American studio would have a lot of financial interest, or MGM especially produced a lot of films in Britain in the 50s because they even had their own UK division studio. They could do this to stretch budgets for sure and use all the wonderful British crews and technicians, but also you saw a lot of American stars or stars who were, shall we say, no longer on the A-list or were seen as less bankable, go to either try and refresh their screen image or recast their screen image, or very canny stars who were thinking about how to package themselves, they would go and be used as the sort of linchpin to then sell this British film in other countries and also have it be marketable in America. So with Action of the Tiger, you have both of those because it's an MGM film made with a British company, but they actually wound up shooting it in Spain, so it has that very sort of European feel, and because it's Spain, it almost has the flavor of what would eventually be an Italian Western type feel, most of which were shot in Spain. But also you have the lead played by Van Johnson in a very definite attempt to sort of break him out of his traditional sort of image, where of course he was most famous for being more of the juvenile lead and then being in a lot of musicals. And here he's playing a sea captain who's very cynical, kind of embittered, and very much a man's man, tough guy who has seen the ways of the world. And it's not necessarily what you would expect for Van Johnson to play, and some people and some critics have said that it doesn't quite work for them. However, this is something you see with a lot of American stars who did this around the same time. Probably the most famous examples would be, of course, Hammer Films remaking the character of Professor Quatermass for their two Val Guest-directed films. They made him a much tougher, more brusque character and had him played by the American actor Brian Donlevy, and it's a fascinating characterization, very different from the original Nigel Neal BBC television version, but that was their way of being able to then sell the films in America by having an American name. The other would, of course, be Alan Ladd, who specifically came over to make films for Warwick Films and also brought over his screenwriter Richard Maybaum, and they made films in Britain for Warwick Films that were also Alan Ladd vehicles, and that way they could be sold in both Britain and America. Now, the reason why I bring up the Alan Ladd Warwick films in particular is because those are part of the DNA of the James Bond films, because Warwick was partially run by Cubby Broccoli, and most of the core team at Warwick are the ones who went on to become the core team of the James Bond films. One of them was, of course, director Terence Young, who is, quite easily the single most important creative input in the entire history of the James Bond films. And he not only set the tone, but he set the style in the first, second, and fourth films in the series. And so here in Action of the Tiger, it's Terence Young in the director's chair. And this is what makes the picture special, and this is what makes it interesting. This is what makes it above your average run-of-the-mill adventure film that most people have forgotten about around this time period. And, of course, all these sort of American studio, European co-productions. Because here, a James Bond fan will be able to pick up on all kinds of different things and see that there is some definite amount of the Bondian DNA that would first erupt in 1962 on Dr. No. There is that Terence Young style. There is that flavor of the exotic. There is a raw sensuality, and there is a certain danger element that makes it feel like, obviously an adventure story, but it kind of has the flavor of a pulp novel or a men's adventure novel, which is really what the original source material for the film started out as, because this was adapted from a book. So it's Terence Young's style that really elevates everything. It's not a perfect film by any means, but this is the factor that infuses an energy into the whole production, and no Bond fan can see this film and not pick up on this, especially because this is also an early film for Sean Connery, who appears in, unfortunately, a very small bit part. He's basically bookending the film at the start and end, but even in a small, very tiny role that doesn't give him much to do, he has his incredible screen presence, and you can't take your eyes off of him, even though his character is kind of an old-fashioned cliche for this type of story. So, of course, Bond fans can look at this and absolutely put it under the microscope, because it is Terence Young directing Sean Connery in 1957, so let that sink in. And many other people have said, well, why couldn't it have been Sean Connery in the lead, and the film probably would have been a lot better, which, I could agree with for sure, but of course that was not going to happen in 1957 with MGM footing the bill, and they were not going to want to put this pretty much unknown Scotsman in the lead of their film. That, of course, had to have an American name to then sell it in the different countries. They did sort of hedge their bets, because they, for the female lead, that we have Martine Carol, who was a gigantic star and sort of sex symbol in France. She was pretty much known as the French Marilyn Monroe, and she actually has a great deal of feistiness in this film, in terms of putting some spirit into her characterization, which, again, is pretty typical in terms of the plotting of what you would see in a sort of men's adventure or old-fashioned adventure pulp novel. But it's, again, Terence Young's style that really starts to pull elements out that make the film more enjoyable, because while the script is kind of, it kind of goes in fits and spurts, and it also changes tones a little bit here and there. It's also quite a bit old-fashioned in that way. So there are some elements that do maybe feel a little bit stodgy, or, obviously of a different era, but it's also, it's balanced quite a bit by Terence Young trying to draw out the energy and the sensuality, and having our two leads. Of course, they're going to develop a relationship over the course of the film, but they also bicker with a certain degree of sensuality. And I've always felt the Terence Young Bond films are the only really sensual Bond films, and I think you even get that quality here, even though it's having to fight against a script that is, a bit old-fashioned and a little bit clunky in places, and also kind of a little bit underbaked in areas. So, it's obviously a film from the 1950s. You're not going to get around that, and it feels like a film from the 1950s, except for this element of the Terence Young style, and this energy, and this slight element of danger, and the light touch of the risque, and also getting the actors to feel comfortable enough to give a sort of give their characterizations a little bit of drive, a little bit of bite, a little bit of grit. So that's why, for me, Van Johnson works extremely well in the film. I was quite surprised, actually. I think he's great in this. I don't think about his previous career at all when I'm seeing him in this film. I think you can actually buy him as this captain / mercenary / man of the world who's seen quite a bit and has a good number of years of experience on him. And then Martine Carol's character, she has a bit of sensitivity, as well as exuding an extreme confidence from the first time you see her, that results in this incredible sense of sensuality, which, again, is something you find in pretty much every Terence Young film that he was really invested in, and of course in his Bond films. And so all of these elements can't help but make a Bond fan go, hey, this is Bondian in 1957. And if that weren't enough, we even have one of Terence Young's all-time favorite actors, the always wonderful, incredible Anthony Dawson, actually pops up here in the film as a rather menacing character, but unfortunately his voice is dubbed, and it's not a particularly large role, but it will make any Bond fan rejoice to see Anthony Dawson pop up. So to discuss the plot and its general setup, we open with Martine Carol's character of Tracy basically trying to find someone to basically get her into Albania to be able to rescue rescue her brother, who has been held as a prisoner of war, presumed dead, possibly. And so she goes to our mercenary sea captain, Carson, who is the Van Johnson character, who is not really given the full story, but agrees to go on this venture simply for the money. And of course, he is obviously intrigued by this very sensual creature who obviously has motivations of her own. His first mate is the Connery character, who we open the film and see him basically get him out of a barroom brawl. But unfortunately, the Connery character is just pretty much kind of a cliched sort of first mate. He has a little bit of charm, of course, and is quite mesmerizing on the screen, but he's then quickly out of the film and only reappears at the end. We then get into Albania, and further complications in the plot ensue that eventually, for the sort of middle and main section of the film, find our increasingly bickering and more attracted to one another lead couple not only find and then try to bring her brother back across the national border, but also have to deal with the refugee children that her brother had been trying to smuggle across the border. So some people have labeled this a sort of end of the sixth happiness section, but it's also got a sort of it's almost akin to a lot of other films that were coming out in the 1950s, where you had a romance story set in the middle of some sort of trek or in some kind of remote location, potentially with war or military forces around them that were obviously threatening whatever the actual plot development was. This could probably be traced back to, say, The African Queen, or also makes you think of Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, for example. So it's very much in keeping with a lot of 1950s films. And to be quite honest, even though the script is obviously a little bit old-fashioned and is a little bit stodgy and feels very 1950s, it's this, again, the Terence Young style, trying to add some energy to things. There's some nice cynical one-liners. There's some elements of dark humor, and it has almost a sense of the world around the story in the characters, and that's what makes the actual plot play pretty well and helps it punch above its weight, instead of being what could have been a very stodgy film that was obviously patterned after a number of other notable films and trying to sell a former top-tier American star, and also hedge their bets with a lot of other characters and other actors and actresses to then sell the film in other countries. Where we really get the burst of energy, though, is when our characters run into a essentially a would-be terrorist, but also someone who decides to aid them, and that is the character of Trifon, played by the incredible Herbert Lom, who pretty much steals every scene that he's in, is as a sort of well, he's not the head of the group, but he's the son of the ruler of this group of what seemed to be a sort of group of almost gypsy-like characters. And of course, this being directed by Terence Young and having a scene set inside the encampment at night, seeing all of the festivities on display and a bit of hostility between female characters, you of course are going to think of the gypsy camp scene from Russia with Love, which of course would only come 6 years later. So this, in some ways, could be seen as a sort of dry run for the gypsy camp scene and From Russia with Love. And you could look at Herbert Lom's character being so lusty and bigger than life and so full of vigor, and you could almost view him as a sort of proto-Carambe as well. So you can't help but feel the Bond parallels, even though this is a completely different story. It is still very 1950s. It is still very dated in certain aspects, but it's also got the requisite pulpy flavor, and it's got the energy and sensuality of a Terence Young film. So it is Herbert Lom who pretty much walks off with the entire film, although I really do like the performances of the two leads, and Van Johnson is obviously trying to go for, or at least the way the character's written, is trying to go for more of, I mean, really it's more of a Bogart type approach. You could see some of the scenes with Bogart, say from To Have Not, when he's doing, basically a variant of Hemingway's character, or even Key Largo, that sort of late 40s, early 50s period of Bogart films. So there's certain elements there that you can recognize as being influenced by earlier films, but it actually manages to pull it off quite well, I think. Not everyone agrees, but I think this is a remarkable film for the time period. And it's never going to be the most impactful film in the world. It didn't have the biggest budget either. But what really makes it work is it's Terence Young. I mean, it's his fingerprints are all over this film, and it's the energy, it's the sense of danger that's there. It's the little sort of breadcrumbs that are part of the James Bondian DNA that we wouldn't see come into full fruition until 1962, but you can see early bits of them here, and that's all the more fascinating for Bond fans. So Bond fans are going to get the most out of this film. I think this is a really enjoyable film for anyone if you're able to give a 1950s very obscure MGM financed European made action adventure film a chance. It's also quite nice to look at. It was nicely photographed in CinemaScope, and apparently also did have a Perspecta audio mix for the premiere engagement. So it does have some sense of grandeur. They were shooting on location. They did shoot the film in Spain, so you do have wonderful locales that really do ground the story in a sense of reality. We really do have our actors wandering around the terrain and making these long treks through the mountain ranges and things. So, you really do get your money's worth, and I think the film is really effective. And again, it's much more effective than it would have been had somebody else made it. So, as people have said before about, what made James Bond work and Dr. No, I can say the exact same thing about what makes Action of the Tiger work. And the answer is Terence Young, Terence Young, Terence Young, and Terence Young. The impact of his style cannot be underestimated, and here you get it in full force. In terms of sensuality, what's interesting about this Warner Archive disc is like a lot of films at this time period, there were sometimes what were termed as the continental versions, where they would do alternate versions or alternate takes of certain scenes that were staged to be more risque or actually have some partial nudity in them. That, of course, would not be used for the American market, which had, the American censor was seen as rather prudish and couldn't stand any flavor of sex whatsoever. But, of course, any violence, you could have as much as you wanted, pretty much. But in this film, there actually apparently was a continental version, and that's what Warner Archive was able to scan. Because basically, Martine Carol's character does some swimming around the boat, and then she climbs back up on board and has some more banter with Van Johnson's character. But here in the Warner Archive version, and this will really surprise you if you've never seen the film before and you're not aware of this, well, when she comes out, she's actually topless. And so it's, of course, very brief and very tasteful and very, very simple, but, it very much makes you go, hey, wait a minute, because you don't expect that in a 1957 film. And there's no way that would be in the US version. And, of course, it wasn't. As you can see in the trailer, they include a snippet from that scene, and she's fully dressed in a swimsuit because that was the version shown in the United States. So you basically have the technically uncut continental version of Action of the Tiger here on the Warner Archive disc, which is fascinating, and it's not mentioned anywhere, but that's actually what you have here. So it's just the one shot. No, it's not anything major, but what it does do is, again, underline this sort of raw sensuality that Terence Young not only highlights but picks up on and actually amplifies, and this builds into the relationship between the lead characters. This underlines the sort of romantic tension, and it also feeds into the flavor of the exotic and the flavor of danger, the excitement factor that is always in one of the truly effective Terence Young films and is part of the James Bond cocktail mixture that Terence Young really helped to create and cement that, unfortunately, very few after him have ever been able to replicate. So I think it actually does serve a particular purpose having that in here, even though it's very minor, but it's just fascinating that we do have that, because most of this stuff was, lost to time or just not real well documented, and the only thing that usually survives is what would be in the primary US release print with the edited or alternate version. Now to talk about the picture quality, this is again a Warner Archive new scan in 2K of apparently an interpositive source, so that would obviously be I suppose the European version, because it has the quote-unquote continental scene of Carol basically being nude in that one sequence, or at least topless. So it's not obviously a scan of the original negative, so it's not as pristine a transfer as it could have been. So I don't know if perhaps obviously this was the best source they could access, so either the negative is stored somewhere in the UK, or may perhaps unfortunately be deteriorated or lost to time. But this does result in a really handsome image. Warner Archive had released the film on a MOD disc DVD before, but obviously that was a very dated master, and this film has not seen a lot of home video releases because it's rather obscure and it's rather rarely even discussed at all. So to have it on a Blu-ray is astounding, really. But this is a really handsome transfer. It very much represents the interpositive they scanned as is. So do expect there are some little bits of generational loss whenever there's a dissolve or any sort of dupe material. Some of that is a bit softer than you might typically see that type of stuff. But again, do keep in mind this is an interpositive and not the original negative. So if you see the occasional soft shot or a little bit of wear, that is to be expected. But it's mostly in the dissolves and transitions and actual dupe optical material shots. Overall, this is a very handsome transfer. There's not really any major damage. There is a little bit of the occasional speck here and there, but they are very fleeting. This was also, rather early on in CinemaScope, so they did photograph it very well, but there are one or two shots that do seem to have a little bit of scope distortion, which is, of course, typical to the original scope lenses. There's not any major cases, it seems, of people having the infamous CinemaScope mump faces where their faces are kind of stretched, but you do get some degree of that here and there, of course. But it's quite well shot for early CinemaScope. It was not easy to shoot a scope film with the original lenses and not run into a lot of those problems. So this is all inherent stuff, but I think it's fascinating to see a well shot scope film from the 1950s. It doesn't suffer from a lot of that stuff. You'll also see some slight quality loss and increased grain when you do have optical shots or some dupe materials and in transitions and things. So that's also because of just the inherent limitations of the source. So all of that is just inherent to what they had to scan. It kind of reminds me of how Warner Archive was able to scan, I believe, some sort of U.S. interpositive for the Sergio Leone film Colossus of Rhodes, and how that is very much an as-is scan of the best U.S. film element they had, and obviously it has all the limitations of that source, but looks really good as a sort of as-is scan of that U.S. print source. Well, here you have that same sort of effect, but it's from apparently the European continental interpositive version, or however you want to label it. So it's a rather handsome looking transfer, and again, I'm just amazed that this film ever got a new scan or a Blu-ray at all. Then to look at the audio, the film does actually credit in the title sequence. Again, it has a Perspecta audio credit, so apparently there was a multi-channel Perspecta stereo track of this film that would have been used in certain engagements, but unfortunately that is, I guess, lost to time, or they didn't have the time or money to then locate and transfer that, because Perspecta is a very intricate process. But it's nice to know that does exist, or did exist. But what we have here is the mono mix presented in a lossless DTS HDMA, which sounds great. It does have some natural hiss, and it does have a little bit of distortion in some of the louder moments and some of the louder music cues. cues as is common for the period. But it sounds relatively healthy, and I'm just glad we have it also freshly transferred with a lossless codec. I just really wish, though, that if the perspective mix does survive, that it could have been transferred as well. Now that, I did realize that this did have a perspective mix, because it does have literally the credit in the title sequence. So this was one of the MGM films where they did do a slightly fancier perspective stereo track for some engagements. So apparently they did have some confidence in this film. They did, put some money into promoting it, but not a whole lot, because again, it kind of just came and went, and it's still very, very obscure. There are one or two artifacts in the audio track. There was a tiny blip in the audio at one point, but again, nothing major, nothing very much out of place, but it seems just inherent to the source they were transferring. Now, as is unfortunately common for Warner Archive discs, the release is otherwise pretty much bare bones. The only thing we have in terms of extras is the original trailer, which is standard def, so unfortunately it's not an HD scan, but it looks pretty solid. The real key, though, is that this does show the alternative shot of Carol's swimming scene that we had in the US version, because they used that little piece in the trailer, and she's got a full bathing suit on, so she is fully covered. So if you wondered about that scene, it being in a 1957 film, and then you go look at the trailer, you can actually see what that shot was like in the US version. So that's rather amusing that you actually have that on the disc. So that's really helpful, because otherwise the disc does not credit any of this, and you would just be scratching your head unless you went and looked at the trailer and saw what is, quite comically the US version, because it's quite a large bathing suit and every bit of her torso is completely covered. So it's, again, rather amusing to compare that to what's in the actual feature, that continental shot. So at least we do have that trailer here, so we can actually see that and have some record of the US version of that sequence, but that's really it in terms of extras. And then we have lovely usage of the original poster art for the cover, as is typical of Warner Archive releases. That is duplicated on the disc label. And then the rear is in the sort of new standard layout design for Warner Archive releases. We have the general blurb about the film, which was on their DVD, and then a few images. But otherwise, this is just the typical film-only, but nicely encoded Warner Archive release from a brand new transfer. But again, all they had apparently was this interpositive that they did a lovely 2K scan of. So all in all, I think this film is absolutely fascinating. It is a must, an absolute must for all James Bond fans, because any Bond fan will see this and immediately pick up on and recognize that Terence Young's fingerprints are all over it, and that there is some of the James Bond DNA in this film, as you see in the various Warwick films and the films they did with Alan Ladd, and all the things that Terence Young directed up unto Dr. No in 1962. You have various elements of the Bond flavor, but here you do get quite a bit of it, and especially a good dose of the sensuality that Young really brought to the Bond series. So this is a must in terms of being one of the incredibly important films that represent a sort of proto-James Bond, or the James Bond formula in the works. And it's essential for understanding Terence Young's directing style, because it's really Terence Young that makes this film tick. He gives it the energy, he puts a life force there, identifies it, and that helps to drive the film along, because otherwise the film would seem, even more stodgy in 1950s than how it still has that inherent flavor to it that Young's style is trying to sort of overcome and surmount in a lot of different ways. So it is still obviously a 1950s action-adventure film made in Europe, with MGM financing it and with an American lead to then sell it in multiple countries. But I think it really manages to overcome all those factors, and it has that unique stamp of Terence Young's style that makes it extremely enjoyable and, again, absolutely essential for all James Bond fans. So this is one of those films that I think all Bond fans should see to understand the sort of cinematic journey that it took for all of the various important key crew members that would eventually land on Dr. No in 1962. You can see how this stuff developed. So you can't really separate this film from being one of the sort of proto-Bond films, because it does have a lot of those elements, and without films like these, we wouldn't really have the Bond series as we know it that started in 1962. So, and of course, again, you also have Terence Young directing Sean Connery in 1957, which in and of itself is absolutely fascinating. So I do really recommend the Warner Archive release of Action of the Tiger. It is a much more obscure film, but the transfer quality is quite exceptional for being able to only work from an interpositive. Plus, you get the added benefit of the one sequence being the more risque European continental version. So that's another added benefit that's a bit fun that's not advertised or anything. So this is another essential Warner Archive title for fans of this film or people who might be interested in this film with a lovely new scan, and so it's just another essential Warner Archive disc. So as always, I hope my babblings about the sort of proto-James Bond films, the incredible talents of Terence Young, the wonderful releases of the Warner Archive and physical media have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do check out Action of the Tiger on this Warner Archive disc if you're at all interested. It's a really fun film. It's a type of film that no one's ever going to make again, unfortunately, because apparently studios absolutely detest adventure films and the entire adventure genre, which is kind of insane, but you can see this film and recognize it's a film from a different time and the kind of film that nobody's ever going to make again, and certainly the kind of film they don't make anymore. But it's also just unbelievably essential for understanding the development and the sort of road to the James Bond films. So please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.